Okay, it's with great pleasure that we have the opportunity to welcome Dr. Shuruq Naguib to the Institute. It's her first visit, and we hope it's the first of, inshallah, many visits. She has a PhD in Islamic Studies from Manchester University, where she shared a supervisor with Sayyid Fatimi. I've had the same supervisor, I believe, for some time. And she's currently a lecturer at Lancaster University in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. Her interests, like many of us here, kind of span both pre-modern Muslim scholarly heritage as well as the Muslim response to modernity. And so we very, very much look forward to hearing her paper today on post-classical tafsir tradition. So you normally have 30-40 minutes for the paper and then some time for question and answers. 40 minutes is good.
So 1.5 hours. I might take 1.5 hours. I might need to stop halfway because I think the printout doesn't include all my papers, so that's fine. It's just the final.
The print view was 40 minutes as well.
Okay, so maybe Farhana timed it. You printed what will suffice for 40 minutes. It's in the middle of the material. Just a few points on where I'm coming from, or my intellectual agenda. I've done some work on tafsir. I've been engaged with it since since 1997 to varying degrees. And I started with classical tafsir and then became interested in modern tafsirs, and especially women's tafsirs. But as Ali pointed out, I'm really interested in examining the continuities, discontinuities within the tradition in the pre-modern period and the modern period. So while my paper is focused on the pre-modern period, I also have some reflections to say at the end about what we think happened in tafsir in the contemporary period. Sorry, do you mind if I just log in here? So this is one aspect of my intellectual agenda. The other one is that having been in Islamic studies for 15 or 16 years now, I can say confidently that tafsir is marginal to the interests of both Muslim and non-Muslim scholars, and that Islamic law, theology, and philosophy continue to be the most prominent traditions and sub-traditions that scholarship looks at. And I think this is a missed opportunity because the tafsir genre includes or preserves so much of the Islamic discourses, both at the intellectual level but also at the cultural level, that can be explored and can tell us more about the development of Muslim thought and practice. And within tafsir studies, another perhaps prejudice is against the late classical material. So within Islamic studies, as I said, there is a certain prejudice against tafsir by preferring law and other more prestigious disciplines within Islam. But within tafsir studies, there is another prejudice whereby only the classics of tafsir, the works of Tabari, Razi, and Qurtubi, we've been talking about him today, are seen as the epitome of the tafsir tradition, whereas later works from the 15th century onwards, particularly within the Sunni tradition, are seen as repetitive, only repetition of what has already been said. So there's nothing new until the contemporary period comes, and then we have all those new reformist tafsirs. So most Muslims really will draw on the Orientalist reformist claims that nothing much happened from the 14th century to the 18th, 19th century of tafsir activities. And this is what I'm trying to challenge today, in addition to other claims about tafsir and its content. So what I'll do today is, this is based on a published long paper, and the paper has a historical and technical side. The technical side often sends people into deep sleep So I'm going to I'm going to look at the historical side, which I think is important to set the scene for thinking about what was happening in the circles which were engaged with tafsir, especially around the 14th, 15th, 16th century. The reason I became interested in this, having been a classicist for a few years, so someone who focused on the classical works in my PhD and afterwards, and then jumped into the contemporary period, is a remark that my supervisor, Colin Imber, who took over my PhD after Norman Calder passed away, said to me. And I've also read his book on Shaykh al-Islam Abu Saud, who was an Ottoman legal scholar at the height of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And he said to me that biographers say about Abu Saud that he wrote a tafsir, that his tafsir is not surpassed by any others except that of Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi, both of which count as classical tafsir. So I became interested. How could such a late tafsir be viewed as important or as significant as the classical ones? So as I explained, my choice to start looking at what we call the post-classical period was guided by a brief comment in Colin Imber. But also, at the time, I was reading the works of Hallaq on Islamic law and his challenge to scholars who proposed the thesis of غلق باب الاجتهاد, the closure of the gate of ijtihad, looking at much later material in fiqh and coming to the conclusion that fiqh was actually continued to be creative, continued to be evolving in the much later centuries. And reading the work of Sayyid Hussein Nasr on Islamic philosophy, particularly Shia philosophy, and also finding out that, there was so much philosophical activity in the late classical or pre-modern period. But I've also come across a nexus of studies on Arabic rhetoric, which drew my attention to probably an interesting intersection between tafsir and Arabic rhetoric in that period. So I started with the tafsir of Abu Saud. It's called Irshad al-Aql al-Salim ila Mazaya al-Kitab al-Hakim. Abu Saud's full name is Muhammad ibn Muhi ad-Din Muhammad ibn Mustafa al-Imadi. He lived in the 16th century and he wrote that tafsir around between 1560 and 1569. So as I've already mentioned, the choice was guided by a brief comment in Colin Imber, and then I looked at other biographical material myself, and the further investigation of biographical and bibliographical tafsir tradition, material on the tafsir tradition, so Tabaqat al-Mufassirin works, all types of Rijal works, and found that the Ottoman peers of Abu Saud received him with acclaim. One of his contemporaries called Tashkubrizada, Ibn Tashkubri, the author of Al-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya, a 16th century work on, again, the Ottoman scholars, composed a panegyric on this Quran commentary, so he praised it in poetry. Later Turkish, Indian, Arab catalogers all concurred that the work of Abu Saud, or Tafsir Abu Saud as it's known, which is called Irshad al-Aql al-Salim, is written in exquisite style, but it's not only because of its style that they commend it, they also commend it because of its content. And every time it is mentioned, it is commended for its rhetorical interpretations. This continues until the 17th century, and we see it in the work of the Yemeni historian Abdul Qadir al-Aidaros, who likens Abu Saud's eloquence to that of the native Arab during the time of the Prophet. Abu Saud was actually described as Sultan al-Mufassirin by one of the historians. We also see a story recorded by the 17th century historian Al-Kafawi, an Ottoman historian, where he relates that a mufti called Qutb ad-Din was highly impressed with Abu Saud's literary eloquence and superiority, and marveled that for someone who never journeyed to the homelands of the Arabs, this ability is without doubt a divine gift. So though Abu Saud was an accomplished linguist described as Imam Ahl al-Lisan, it is definitely his exegetical prowess that is mainly extolled by the 17th century scholars and catalogers. Even a 19th century Yemeni scholar who belongs to the reformist movement considers it, and I quote, one of the greatest, most excellent and most accurate works of tafsir. I'm referring to Al-Shawkani. Abu Saud spent a lifetime greatly preoccupied with the practice of and administration of the law. So all of his life he was trained in the law, taught the law in the Ottoman colleges, and then was appointed as Qadi after being a teacher, and then managed to rise up the ladder to become Shaykh al-Islam. However, of his legacy, he only wrote a couple of treatises, one on waqf, the permissibility of the cash waqf, and another which is contested as whether it's to be attributed to him or not. But he is known mostly for his tafsir. In fact, in a 19th century Indian biographical dictionary of Hanafi scholars, Abu Saud is listed as Abu Saud al-Mufassir, not Abu Saud Shaykh al-Islam or the Faqih or the Qadi. And in the bibliographical literatures, there are many super commentaries on his tafsir listed. We know from later sources that his work was included in the religious curriculum, and maybe some of you know that once there are super commentaries, that is an indication that it was taught, it was part of a religious curriculum, because the super commentaries were mainly notes and glosses for students. But also in contemporary histories of tafsir, so Ibn Ashur, the Tunisian scholar of tafsir, emphasizes Abu Saud's linguistic genius in his rhetorical and linguistic tafsir of the Quran. He claims, Ibn Ashur, that this 16th century tafsir was attentive to the tafsir of al-Zamakhshari, well known for setting the stage for rhetorical interpretation of the Quran, tafsir al-Balaghi, as being, unprecedented in its nuanced understanding of Zamakhshari. An Egyptian historian of tafsir who died in 1976, his name is Al-Dhahabi, and he wrote a seminal 3-volume work on the history of tafsir called Al-Tafsir wal-Mufassirun, also agrees with Ibn Ashur that Abu Saud of the 16th century wrote a wonderful linguistic tafsir of the Quran. So there are indicators in all these works that Abu Saud is not just a tafsir which includes all the hashw of the other works of tafsir, to paraphrase Ibn Taymiyyah, who did not consider tafsir to be a proper discipline because of all the hashw and the unnecessary material, and he exemplifies the hashw with the work of Al-Razi, because Al-Razi included medicine. He says the Razi's tafsir includes everything but tafsir, and he had such commentary on a lot of tafsir works. He did not consider it a proper discipline, and it is well known in, I don't know if this maxim has, you've come across it before or not, but tafsir is considered to be a discipline that is half-baked in the history of Islamic sciences. So fiqh was well cooked, and tafsir is half-baked. So it's interesting to see that, in fact, even contemporary historians of tafsir who have investigated Irshad, authored by Abu Saud, say that it's an exquisite tafsir of the Quran's language and style. So how do we, there are a couple of interesting issues here. Well, first, Abu Saud is a legal scholar, and his main literary legacy is a tafsir work. Secondly, that tafsir work is celebrated from the 16th century until the 20th century onwards without fail, not only by Ottoman historians, but also by Arab, Indian, and historians from Tunisian historians of tafsir from across the Muslim world. I still need to find out if it is mentioned in any of the Shi'i or Persian sources. That would be interesting. So how do we understand this? Is this tafsir significant because it was idiosyncratic in terms of its attention to rhetoric? So was Abu Saud something of a shooting star in the history of tafsir? Or is there a context in which, an intellectual context in which Abu Saud developed his work? So I turn now to Abu Saud himself and what he says in his introduction to the tafsir, the preface. He produces a narrative about why he wrote that tafsir work. In the preface to Irshad, he explains how he came to compose this work. He presents Irshad as belonging to a genre, that is, he refers to tafsir, which matured from a first stage of verification, during which exegetes were preoccupied with doing the groundwork of explicating the basic meanings, constructing the basic structures of the discipline, elucidating the purposes, organizing the rules, and all of that. To a second stage, which he justifies as a maturer stage, or explains as a maturer stage. This second stage is one that includes in-depth examination during which mufassirs devoted their efforts to showing the superb qualities of meaning of the Quran, the magnificent hidden meanings in order for people to behold evidence of its inimitability. So the tafsir work is one that reveals the i'jaz of the Quran, the inimitability of the Quran. That's a different mission in that second stage. Abu Saud locates his own commentary in this latter stage, which he clearly associates with a subgenre of tafsir that developed from the intersection between the disciplines of rhetoric and the theological concept of the Quran's linguistic inimitability, which I'll comment on in a minute. But it's fascinating that a faqih who spent at least 60 years doing fiqh thinks that a tafsir work is not about clarifying the connection between the Quran and the fiqh, but it's about clarifying the inimitability, the poetic nature of the style, and the beauty of the language. So what I'll do next is to try to contextualize Irshad and its exegetical context. So was Abu Saud, as I said, just a shooting star in the history of tafsir? And what was his intellectual trajectory? What made him think that the real purpose of a tafsir work is one that looks at language specifically with a focused purpose? In his view, in Abu Saud's view, the second stage reached a pinnacle in the commentaries of Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi. Al-Zamakhshari is from the 12th century, Persian Mufassir Al-Baydawi from the 13th century. His work, he maintains, Irshad, is the continuation of these two works, which appear to have constituted a subgenre. The very production of Irshad is justified by Abu Saud as the fruition of decades of reflection upon these two commentaries, which began long before he embarked on writing it. So he reminisces, he remembers, in earlier days and long past times and years, when I occupied myself with studying and revising Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi, and I took the stand to dispute and study them with others, it occurred to my mind day and night that I should thread together their pearl-like merits in a refined style and arrange the most brilliant of their marvels in an elegant order. So this faqih, during his training in the religious law, he was day and night thinking about Al-Zamakhshari rather than Marginal or Quduri. That was basically the foundation of the college, as George Maqdisi claims, was to train scholars in fiqh. But this faqih, or this legal student during his student days, was actually focusing on tafsir, and not any type of tafsir, the tafsir subgenre which emerges from al-Zamakhshari's interest in rhetoric. Although Abu Saud proclaims his indebtedness to al-Zamakhshari and al-Baydawi alike, there is evidence that he cultivated a special interest in al-Zamakhshari. May I ask if any of the members of staff or students teach Zamakhshari at all, or is it part of the curriculum?
It's not taught, but it's referred to.
Okay. So it's good to say a few things about that text. Although Abu Saud proclaims his indebtedness to al-Zamakhshari and al-Baydawi alike, there is evidence he cultivated a special interest in al-Zamakhshari's tafsir, widely known as al-Kashaf. During his years as professor at one of the prestigious 8 colleges of Al-Fatih Mosque, Muhammad II or Muhammad II Mosque in Istanbul, Al-Kashaf was the main work of tafsir which Abu Saud taught. So he taught for a period before becoming a qadi, and he taught tafsir. He taught fiqh, he taught tafsir. And the main work of tafsir he taught was that of al-Zamakhshari. A 16th century jurist and a former student of Abu Saud called Abdul Karim Zadeh, to pronounce it in Turkish way, recalled that he heard from Abu Saud al-Kashaf on Quran exegesis and al-Bukhari on the prophetic traditions. So already indicating the prestigious status of al-Zamakhshari in the tafsir studies of the 16th century. But it could have been only Abu Saud who was particularly interested in it. So the question that I want to leave hanging there was that interest in the Zamakhshari idiosyncratic, or was it more symptomatic of the tafsir activities, teaching and writing activities of the time? There's also evidence that Abu Saud continued teaching al-Kashaf during his years as judge. The Ottoman biographer Ali ibn Lalibali relates in a book called Al-Iqd al-Manzoom, which supplements Al-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya, relates that Hassan Beg, employed in the service of the Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, befriended Abu Saud, who was the then military judge of Rumelia. Military judge was also a faqih, had to be a trained faqih in the Ottoman Empire, and studied with him Al-Kashaf, starting from the victory chapter, Surah Al-Fath. That happened during the Hungarian campaign. So they were actually out on Ghazu, wanting to conquer Hungary. And during their free time, what they did was not study fiqh. They studied tafsir and they studied al-Kashaf. And Rustam Basha studied with Abu Saud his gloss, Abu Saud's gloss Ma'aqid al-Tiraf, which he particularly wrote to teach during the Hungarian campaign. There is also evidence that Abu Saud continued teaching al-Kashaf during his years as judge. And during the Hungarian campaign was one instance of that. Also of note is that in the year Irshad was completed, Sultan Sulaiman al-Qanuni issued a decree stipulating the acquisition of key textbooks for the imperial colleges. The decree would have been produced in consultation with Abu Saud. This took place in 1565. The decree would have been produced in consultation with Abu Saud, who enjoyed a very close relationship with the Sultan. Again, the biographical material is full of anecdotes about the close relationship between the two. It is not insignificant, therefore, that the first book named in the decree is actually Al-Zamakhshari's Al-Kashaf, and that of the 12 other tafsirs, which are also listed and constitute all of the tafsir works on the list, constitute third of the required books as part of the curriculum of the 8 colleges. 4 of the 12 tafsir works are super commentaries on Al-Kashaf, and only one is the related work of Al-Baydawi. Al-Baydawi's Anwar al-Tanzil is also related to Az-Zamakhshari. It is, as some scholars describe it, a cleansing of the Mu'tazilite theology within Al-Kashaf. And usually the two are coupled. So if you study Al-Kashaf and you're Sunni Ash'ari, you have to study Al-Baydawi to protect you from its Mu'tazilite doctrines. The later exegete Al-Baydawi condensed Al-Kashaf in Anwar al-Tanzil He condensed the grammatical, semantic, and rhetorical discussions. So as I just pointed out, Al-Baydawi's Anwar became a necessary supplement for those interested in the rhetorical insights of Al-Kashaf. Its summaries and explanations of Al-Baydawi's Anwar, despite being a commentary cleansing of Al-Kashaf, also gained popularity for their own merit. They were easy to read, easier than Al-Kashaf anyway, giving rise to numerous glosses and super commentaries which addressed parts of Al-Baydawi or all of it. Although the primacy of Al-Kashaf remained uncontested because of its historical and intellectual precedence as the first tafsir work dedicated to rhetorical interpretation, Ottoman scholars of Abu Saud milieu in the 16th century wrote far more commentaries on Al-Baydawi's work than on Al-Zamakhshari. Okay, so that's an interesting twist in the story about tafsir in the 16th century of the Ottoman Empire. His contemporaries, Abu Saud's contemporaries, wrote super commentaries for the students more on Baydawi than on the Zamakhshari. This could have been a kind of theological conservatism. In Al-Adrinawi's Tabaqat, this is an Ottoman Tabaqat, a lesser known Tabaqat al-Mufassirin work by an Ottoman scholar. In the chapter in which he deals with the 16th century exegetes, he lists 80 of them. 50 wrote glosses on Al-Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi, some only on one and some on both. 50 out of 80 exegetes produced super commentaries on those and only those. A possible reason is that Anwar was part of the foundational tafsir curriculum, whereas Al-Kashaf was studied at a higher stage as evidenced in Tashki-Prozada's autobiographical account of his own education. I'll come back to this. So Tashki-Prozada, or Ibn Tashkubri, the author of Al-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya, which is a historical book, as I mentioned, on the Ottoman scholars. In that book, he also wrote a long autobiographical note on his religious education, which would be really interesting for anyone who is examining or investigating religious education in the late medieval period. It was also very common at this stage of education to study primary text through secondary works, commentaries, marginal notes, and glosses, so shuruh and ta'liqat, basically. It's not unlikely then that the scholastic commentaries on Anwar exceed those of Al-Zamakhshari because Al-Anwar was taught at the foundational level. So there are more students at the foundational level. You want your book to sell, or your sharh to sell, your ta'liqa to sell. It's like a textbook. You write on Al-Baydawi and then it gains wide audience or a wide readership. In fact, according to an interesting anecdote which shows that Al-Baydawi's tafsir was in high demand amongst students, Tashki-Prozada tells us in his autobiographical note that he used to feed his students during Ramadan by copying and selling Al-Baydawi's tafsir once every year. So throughout the year he would be copying Al-Baydawi's tafsir and then sell this exquisite signature version or edition of Al-Baydawi, and that would fetch 3,000 dirhams, enough to feed all his students for the whole month. So again, that signifies the social history of the tafsir and works, the teaching of them and their production, signifies the importance of these works in the intellectual milieu of Abu Saud. For example, among those who commented on Al-Baydawi in Abu Saud's milieu are Muhyiddin Muhammad ibn Musli and his surname by which is known as Al-Qujawi or Al-Qujavi, son of the mystic guide of Abu Saud's father. Al-Qujavi wrote an 8-volume commentary on Anwar al-Tanzil intended as a tafsir primer for the beginner. It became very popular, and he later produced, upon the demand of the booksellers, he produced an edited version after a few years, which also became highly demanded. So the copyists merged the two versions and produced a third version of Al-Qujavi's commentary on Al-Baydawi. Abu Saud's own father wrote a sharh or a commentary on Al-Baydawi known as Ta'liqat al-Iskilipi. Reasons for this avid attention. So I'm telling you all this historical detail, trying to overwhelm you with the importance of Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi. Reasons for this avid attention to the Quran commentaries of Zamakhshari and Al-Baydawi can be attributed primarily to the importance of the religious discipline of tafsir, as reflected in the lists of books required for the 8 imperial colleges in 1565. But why these two tafsirs? Okay, we know that tafsir is important to study the Quran. We understand it as supplementary to the discipline of fiqh. But why these two tafsirs, and why al-Kashaf at all, especially in light of its unorthodox theological content? There's no one explanation for the centrality of Al-Kashaf and Anwar in the tafsir activities surrounding Ottoman religious education during the 16th century. There are, however, a number of varied but interrelated factors which may have contributed to the significance of these two works. Some of the more evident ones are the fundamental necessity for the study of Arabic for religious education, something I think you know about in this college, which encompassed tafsir, hadith, law, and theology. So you needed Arabic in order to study any of these disciplines. In addition to the rise of the college or madrasa or kulliya systems as the key provider and regulator of religious education. So in order to get a religious education, you had to go to a madrasa. In order to get that religious education, you needed Arabic. And within these colleges, the learning of Arabic became very important for the Ottoman Turkish-speaking milieu. Thirdly, institutionalization of the primacy of language studies in these colleges, as I just explained. And fourthly, the emergence of the Ottoman college as one of the main routes for entering and rising in the administrative hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire, at the center of which was the judiciary, which drew its members from the ranks of the college professors. So the college was not just for religious education. People did not do it because of piety or because of the need or the taklif to do ulum ad-din or the religious sciences. This became a very successful career path. You want to arrive, if you're not part of the military, if you want to be part of the bureaucracy, this was one sure way of getting high up the ladder. Competence in the Arabic language obviously would have been necessary for anyone who aspired for a career as a college professor and judge. Ottoman college students must have striven, as many of the students here I'm sure, to achieve the high levels of Arabic proficiency requisite for the advanced study of the religious disciplines to progress in their college careers. Not only, what I'm trying to argue is that they didn't only do that because they wanted to construct the religious authority within the Muslim community as knowing Arabic and having access to the classics of the religious disciplines, but also there were socio-economic factors for making Arabic important because of the significance of the college career. You could become a military judge or a mufti in the Ottoman Empire, all of which were highly paid jobs. Mastery of Arabic would have characterized the most successful, as exemplified by Abu Saud himself and his remarkable progression from a college teacher to the Shaykh al-Islam, perhaps the longest serving Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire. He served for more than 30 years. It is not inconceivable then that the linguistic disciplines became more than auxiliary forms of religious knowledge instrumental for legal reasoning. Knowledge and expertise in the linguistic disciplines, including rhetoric, likely became a marker of high culture and prestige. So those who arrived or became or reached the top administrative hierarchy were also cultural and public figures. And their knowledge of Arabic signified their achievement and became a sign of their high or significant education, high culture, and prestige for the Ottoman intellectual class of college professors and legal bureaucrats in general. This is not too dissimilar to what happened during the Umayyad period. During the Umayyad period, there was so much focus on what some scholars call studia adabiyya or literary studies, but they were more secular during the Umayyads. They were not so tied up with the religious disciplines. So we had the poets, the court writers or court katibs. We had people like Al-Jahid, who wrote text or treatises on Arabic and rhetoric and poetry, which had no religious content necessarily. But the secularity of the literary studies of the Umayyad period diminished as the college rose in the history of Islamic civilization. With the relocation of the study of Arabic and literature into the college, the religious content of the Arabic language program became more important, far more important than in the 9th and 10th century of Islam. More specific reasons which account for Al-Kashaf's prominence is that it captures in its hermeneutic effort or tafsir effort the convergence, the intersection in the 10th and 11th century of Islam of two trajectories, two disciplines or two directions of Islamic religious thought. The trajectory of Arabic literary studies and that of the theological preoccupation with the miraculous nature of the Quran. This convergence was ultimately established through the work of the Persian Ash'arite scholar Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, who firmly defined the Quran's miracle in terms of its linguistic and literary beauty. Earlier arguments on i'jaz for those who are doing theology moved from an interest in sarfa, God made them not able to imitate the Quran, to its content, so the Quran contained ghaib material, to its beauty. And sometimes the i'jaz theory, and you can refer to the work of Isa Bullata or Margaret Larkin, the i'jaz theory mixed all those, especially in the later centuries, mixed all those three elements of i'jaz, sarfa, ghaib. Do you do this, the topic of i'jaz in theology? Sarfa, ghaib, and i'jaz, linguistic i'jaz, sorry?
In Ulum al-Quran.
In Ulum al-Quran. But by the 11th century, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani focused the i'jaz discourse on the linguistic inimitability of the Quran, the miraculous style of the Quran. And developed a concept of the Quran's literary inimitability, which would eventually lead to changing the nature and spirit of Arabic literary studies from being secular to being completely located in the Quran. So his two works, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's Asrar al-Balagha and Dalail al-I'jaz, developed a concept of the Quran's literary inimitability on the basis of a linguistic theory of eloquence, balagha. Eloquence, according to Abdul Qahir, resides in how the structure of meanings and idea, that is ma'ani. Ma'ani actually means both meanings and ideas in Abdul Qahir, is effectively expressed through the word arrangement, nazm. Might be a term that some of you are familiar, particularly of the figurative speech. So Abdul Qahir was really interested in figures of speech, metaphors, in Arabic isti'ara, tamthil, which are not central to religious thought. But interestingly, what I will be arguing in the next part is that they became central to religious thought, cultural expression, and the intellectual life of the Ottoman scholars of the 16th century. Rhetorical devices such as metaphor and metonymy, according to Abdul Qahir of the 11th century, became fulcrums of the Quran's effectiveness. In his two works, he applied his theory of eloquence both to poetry and Quranic examples. It was not until the following century that a more systematic application of his theory to the whole Quran was attempted by who? By Al-Zamakhshari in a work of Tafsir. So Abdul Qahir's theory, which redefined our understanding in Muslim civilization of the connection between the Arabic language and the Quran, and located or relocated literary studies in Quranic studies, or connected both of them, is not expressed, or the influence of it, or the impact of it, to use a modern word in higher education today, was not felt until the work of Al-Zamakhshari. So Al-Zamakhshari's work, actually, the importance and significance of it is that it epitomizes that intersection between Arabic literary studies and tafsir work. So Zamakhshari developed Abdul Qahir's theory in his analysis of the relation between ma'na and nazm, or the semantic to the grammatical. I'm not going to go too much into the detail of Abdul Qahir's theory. I might, if anyone is interested, and how it has impacted tafsir in tafsir's content. But suffice it to say that the convergence between literary and tafsir studies brought about by these two works, Abdul Qahir's theoretical work, the two theoretical works, Asrar al-Balagha and Dalail al-I'jaz, and Al-Zamakhshari's Al-Kashaf, resulted in an independent interest in the cultivation of taste for Arabic rhetoric and poetics in order to grasp the beauty of the Quran, and thus strengthened the intersection between what we can call culture. So interest in language and poetry and so on is a sign of culture, and religious piety, attention to the divine word. Such intersections in Muslim civilization are evident in architecture, for example, where culture and religious piety converge. From the 13th century onwards, Al-Kashaf was at the center of scholastic, linguistic, literary, and tafsir studies. If you wanted to study the Arabic language, you can't ignore Al-Kashaf. If you wanted to study Arabic balagha, you can't ignore Al-Kashaf. If you wanted to study tafsir, that's where you find Al-Kashaf, because there is an interest in the language of the Quran. Stimulating a striking number of glosses and super commentaries. In fact, Haji Khalifa's Kashf al-Zunun, which is a late classical bibliographical work, lists all the commentaries on all the main tafsir works that were important for the Muslim world of the time. And Al-Kashaf has, I think, 10 pages of commentaries and super commentaries. None of the other tafsirs has anything like that. I think maybe Al-Qurtubi has 2 pages of names of commentaries. So apparently, we can almost speak of Al-Kashaf studies in the medieval period as a subfield in its own right in tafsir. In fact, in light of its place in the curriculum, in the college curriculum, and the intellectual interest Al-Kashaf garnered, one might venture to speak speculatively of Al-Kashaf studies as a subfield, though this would require further historical and textual investigation to substantiate such claims. The intellectual engagement with Al-Kashaf represents, therefore, not so much a concern for fathoming the depth of the Quran's meaning as the primary source of law. This is not just Abu Saud, but this is his milieu, but a genuine interest in linguistic and literary studies. So this became a real interest in the Arabic language and in its literature, which is anchored in the Quran. To a certain degree, this considerable and constant preoccupation with Al-Zamakhshari around that time also endured due to the theoretical interest of Central Asian scholars in the work of Abdul Qahir in the following century. So it wasn't just transpiring in tafsir. Super commentaries and theoretical interest in rhetoric were growing quite impressively after Abdul Qahir's work. Of great significance is Al-Sakkaki's 13th century rhetorician, Al-Sakkaki's Miftah al-Ulum, Key to the Sciences, widely known as Al-Miftah, where he proposes a tripartite paradigm for the study of language, which includes Nahw, Sarf, Balagha, and Balagha. In this final part of Al-Sakkaki's Miftah on Al-Balagha, we're introduced to Abdul Qahir's distinction between meaning and rhetorical devices. The Sakkaki's Miftah al-Ulum became a classical text in its own right, and further commentaries upon it and debates continued, which I might mention toward the end of this paper. But it's interesting to mention him because 10 minutes, okay. So your timing with my paper was excellent. Abu Saud's on education attests to Miftah's importance, and indeed to the centrality of the linguistic and literary studies to religious education. In a memoir preserved by his biographers, Abu Saud recounts that his elementary education with his father covered 3 key texts, including Sharh al-Muftah. So his father was also a college teacher. He taught him 3 texts. One of them is Al-Muftah, which is one of them is the Sharh al-Muftah, which is an influential commentary on As-Sakkaki's work by the another Persian scholar, As-Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani of the 15th century. That's another Jurjani to the Abdul Qahir of the 11th century. As-Sayyid al-Sharif wrote Sharh al-Muftah, but Abu Saud also learned Hashiyat al-Tajreed and Sharh al-Mawaqif, which are commentaries on Shi'i theological texts, as far as I know. However, the text that he revised twice and learned by heart was not Sharh al-Mawaqif, was not Hashiyat al-Tajreed, was actually Sharh al-Miftah. So interestingly, this could be because it's a very difficult and complicated text and he needed to master it. The attention of Abu Saud's father to his son's linguistic and literary training is especially noted by the late 16th century Ottoman historian Mahmoud al-Kafawi, who observes that under his father's rigorous tutelage, Abu Saud excelled at a young age in literary studies, poetry and belles-lettres, and surpassed his peers in balagha. Moreover, biographers draw attention to Abu Saud's later studies with Ibn al-Mu'ayyad or Mu'ayyad Zada, who was an Ottoman scholar who, for political reasons, spent 7 years in Shiraz and studied with Jalal ad-Din al-Dawani and studied Arabic rhetoric as well as theology and mathematics. But it's the connection with Ibn Mu'ayyad and the lineage to Jalal ad-Din al-Dawani, which Abu Saud is very proud of, and from which he extends his authority in teaching the literary studies, as one of the license recorded in Al-Shaqa'iq al-Nu'maniyya say. Evidently, on the basis of this information, Abu Saud had excellent knowledge of these disciplines, but by no means was he the only one well trained in them. There is ample evidence in the Ottoman biographical literature that linguistic and literary studies were focal to the learning of Abu Saud's Ottoman milieu. 2 prominent 16th century scholars might serve as very good examples. I'll only mention one and I'll stop. Because you've only printed one example, which is excellent timing. One is someone I've already mentioned, Tashkir Pirzada, and the other is Kamal Pasha Zada, who was, or Ibn Kamal Pasha, known sometimes, or is notoriously known for a small treatise, erotic treatise called The Rejuvenation of the Old Man. Abu Saud's he was also Abu Saud's influential predecessor as Shaykh al-Islam for 10 years and one of the most prolific writers of his time on matters of rhetoric. He wrote about 300 treatises, at least 100 of them were on language and rhetoric. But going back to Tashkir Pirzada, he studied Al-Sharif al-Jurjani's Sharh al-Muftah like Abu Saud, and he talked about that in his autobiographical note, which I mentioned. He studied Al-Baydawi at the foundation level, and he started to do Al-Zamakhshari once he mastered As-Sakkaki's Miftah through the Sharh of Al-Sharif al-Jurjani. Trying to sum up this in a couple of minutes without going into the evidence of the education of Tashkir Pirzada and the writings of Kamal Pasha Zada, who are both contemporaries of Abu Saud and whose work and learning reflects a serious interest in the work of Al-Sakkaki, which is itself stemming from the work of Abdul Qahir, is that this engagement with rhetoric was out of interest for the subject. It developed a life of its own. It was not only to serve the linguistic requirements of studying fiqh, that became an aspect of culture, and it developed the religious scholars' interest in rhetorical tafsir around that time. I'll stop here, but if I may make some conclusions, the more in-depth examination of the content of their tafsir work reflects awareness not only of the shuruh of the work of Abdul Qahir, but also an awareness of what Abdul Qahir himself says. This is significant because one of the claims of much of the scholarship on this period, where it exists, is that the Muslim scholars of the 16th and 17th century lost touch with the original classical texts and only knew them through shuruh. But the investigation of the tafsirs these figures wrote shows something completely different, that they were understanding through their learning these key classical texts through shuruh, but in their later intellectual production, they were engaging with the text directly and reinterpreting the meaning of the text and contesting what the shuruh actually say in a very creative way. And I don't have time, of course, to give you an example. The other claim that some of this work may actually challenge is that reformist Arabic mufassirs claim that they introduced a new kind of tafsir which is far more specialized and focused on language in order to get rid of the corpus of Israeliyat and unnecessary material that has crept in through mysticism or hadith or even pseudo hadith material, akhbar and so on. And that, from the classical period to the 19th century in the Arab world, we have Muhammad Abdu, who claims to have rediscovered Abdul Qahir al-Jirjani. I have actually very recently located a sharh work by an Azhari scholar of the 19th century, contemporary of Muhammad Abdu, the figure of Arab Islamic reformism, called Shaykh al-Saqqa, and it's called Hashiyat al-Saqqa. And Hashiyat al-Saqqa is a hashiyah on Abu Saud's tafsir engaging with the rhetorical material. So the claim that reformist Arab Muslim scholars were discovering the long-lost treasures or pearls of the classical period, which Muslims ignored to their detriment and went into the dark ages, is almost one of the, could be compared to the myth of Ghalq Bab al-Ijtihad. Shall I stop here? Okay. Thank you very much.
Discussion, and you can elaborate in the questions. Huh?
Okay.
Okay, so we have some time for questions and comments and hopefully some discussion. So please.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it actually. Just because I'm totally ignorant of this Abu Saud, the first time I heard there was such a scholar in Turkey called Abu Saud. Tafsir is not my area of interest anyway. But I'm very familiar with Zamakhshari, not because I'm interested in tafsir, because I was interested in literature and doing some balagha and teaching some grammar. My interest in Zamakhshari was balagha business. But later I developed a type of interest in Zamakhshari to its theological foundation. Now my question is, how much this Abu Saud and other people are theologically influenced by Zamakhshari, particularly idea of, Adliya idea. Have you seen any?
Abu Saud was a Maturidi, of course, and I've looked at one example where Al-Zamakhshari's rhetorical interpretation is applied. Well, first of all, let me put forward this disclaimer. I've looked at Zamakhshari on several occasions and found that his rhetorical interpretation is not always, when he uses and applies metaphor, it's not always theologically driven. So sometimes when he, in interpreting references to purity in the Quran, such as in Surah Al-Muddathir, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, he's not bothered about haqiqa and majaz. He says both the haqiqa and majaz can be applied here. You can understand it in a haqiqa meaning, keeping the thawb ritually clean or tahir, or you can understand it in a majazi meaning, with reference to the Arabic idiomatic usage of thiyab to refer to nafs or amal or all of that. So Zamakhshari's rhetorical interpretations were not always guided by his theological agenda. However, I've looked at one instance where he was guided by theological agenda. The verse بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعرضنا الأمانة على السماوات والأرض, and here Zamakhshari is highly concerned about this ard and whether there is the samawat al-ard or the cosmic bodies are to be understood as having irada or as having agency, and then he applies takhyil. He doesn't use the word takhyil exactly. He says تتخيل. So in this, the aim of this verse is that the image, الصورة تتخيل, that they are like human beings. But this is a takhyil, to compare between the situation of the human being and the situation of the universe. The universe doesn't have an irada, doesn't have agency. Here Abu Saud is not bothered about, when I looked at Abu Saud, he is not at all bothered about the theological aspect. He's only concerned with the surah. He is concerned with the surah and the agency of the cosmic bodies is not engaged with, or the idea itself, the theological problem is not engaged with. All he's concerned with is to analyze, following Abdul Qahir's program of rhetorical analysis of tamthil, and this is the technical side of my paper, which I don't want to bore you with. It's a very rigorous analysis of the grammatical structure to develop an understanding not of the text, but of not of its meaning, not of the ma'na, but of ma'na al-ma'na. So there is a double interpretation happening here, because the surah is not metaphorical. The surah is haqiqa. The surah, the elements of the surah are not majaz in themselves, as as a Zamakhshari might have thought. So the ard itself is not majaz. The ard, the whole verse is a surah rather than majaz at the level of the lexical word. So there are no isti'arat. The whole sentence should be understood as a haqiqa in terms of developing a poetic image. It's the poetic image that leads to a real meaning, which is that humanity is given a very serious responsibility. It's a very Abdul Qahir style rhetorical understanding. So he's not worried about the theological concerns of or the same concerns.
It happens a lot that Mu'tazila, when they are in short of their ta'wil interpretation, they borrow something from the Sufis. It's not the only rule you see that the Mu'tazila, because they have the same agenda, this ta'wil agenda. So if they can't do it with a literalistic way, why not to go to Sufi, how they understand this ayah?
But he doesn't go to the Sufis, he analyzes the grammatical structure. The grammatical structure.
No, the takhayyul one is the Sufi.
The takhyil one, well, it's also based on Abdul Qahir, but it goes in Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani. He was a rhetorician. I haven't read Dalail al-A'jaz and Asrar al-Balagha as a Sufi work. They come across as, but there could be a Sufi work, a Sufi spirit permeating it. What I understand from it is it's definitely a philosophical work about language. And this is something else that, because I haven't managed to discuss the whole paper.
Sorry, I made a mistake, not Jurjani. Gilani is the, yes, Jurjani is the Gilani one. Or the two. No,
Abdul Qadir al-Jilani is the Sufi mystic, yeah. No, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani was...
The Adib one.
Yeah.
The Adib one.
And his approach was very much to analyze the logic of the structure, so all based on evidence in the material rather than an inspired interpretation. And this is what Abu Saud does. He develops a Zamakhshari's interpretation while ignoring his theology and developing an analysis of the poetic image of the Quran. And my analysis of him in comparison with the earlier tafsirs, including that of Baydawi, is that he moves a long way in applying Abdul Qahir's program, and I can see why later historians of tafsir saw that he was really interesting. This is published, so I'm not making these claims without having that corroborated elsewhere.
the Maturidi was the main theological school at that time?
In the Ottoman Empire. In the Ottoman Empire, the most Ottoman scholars were Maturidis, but I mean, they also drew on Al-Ghazali, and there were intersections with Ash'ari works. They learned Hashiyat al-Tajreed of Al-Sharif al-Jirjani, which is on Al-Tusi's work, and I understand that Tusi is a Shi'i theologian. So I think, as we were talking in the library, yeah. In fact, the lower madrasas were called Tajreed madrasas, or Hashiyat al-Tajreed madrasas in the Ottoman Empire. So the cross-denominational learning was definitely there. I mean, the lineage of Abu Saud goes to the Shirazi school, to Jalaluddin al-Dawani. So I don't think the theological sensitivities played a huge role, particularly within the tafsir material. But I think we could explore that in the other disciplines. I just don't have the information.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I mean, you gave more than one argument for it, so maybe it's cut the argument out from its roots, or the comment was, you said he was known as a mufassir despite being a faqih for 60 years. Yeah? Is it because of, and then you mentioned the selling of the tafsir to fund his students, and so the public demand for tafsir. So like we see this with the Al-Mahdi that we were speaking about. Yeah? He's known in public as a mufassir. I think really he's a philosopher, to me anyway. I don't know, predominantly he's a philosopher. And you see actually in his tafsir, it's a philosophical tafsir. But the public reception is primarily of him as a mufassir. And so is that perception of the scholar shaped by actually public reception of his work rather than his scholarship? You know, so first and foremost, these guys will know better, but it seems to me that Tabatabai is a philosopher first and foremost rather than a mufassir. And even though he's applied his philosophical tools to his tafsir, but the wider public, some may be unaware that he's a mufassir, that he's a philosopher. So have we got this dynamic going on?
I think it's different in the case of Abu Saud. Because I gave too much historical information, probably. The scholar who copied Al-Baydawi's tafsir was Tashki-Prozada, not Abu Saud. Abu Saud's only literary legacy was the tafsir work. He was known as the Shaykh al-Islam, the Mufti Sultan, sometimes because of his close relationship with Sulaiman al-Qanuni. He helped restructure the relationship between Qanun and Sharia during Sulaiman's time. He was the lead person for the legal reforms of Sulaiman's time. And he was known as the Mufti as well. But within, actually, it's the scholarly reception that has put him down as the mufassir in terms of his scholarly and intellectual achievement. In terms of his job and function in the Ottoman Empire, he was the mufti. But in terms of his scholarly achievement, he was the mufassir. And it's interesting that when he was asked why he wouldn't collect his fatawa in a book, he says, why would I collect my fatawas if they are all based on al-fatawa al-Bazzaziyya? I would shy away. I haven't brought anything new. But with regard to his tafsir, he was clear in the preface, as I tried to show, that he felt the tafsir was uncooked. He doesn't use that analogy, but he felt there is more to be said about tafsir, there is more to be done in tafsir, and spent 10 years. And he even took a sabbatical, which was organized by Sultan Sulaiman. The interesting part of the story is that Sultan Sulaiman was behind the writing of a tafsir work. He was very interested in it for a number of reasons, partly intellectual, partly political. So at his time, the Ottoman Empire was being constructed as the protector of the Sunni world, and then they conquered the holy places. So they were protecting the holy places. They were protecting the doctrine. They were protecting the actual place where Islam was born, and probably he was interested in offering the Muslim world a work of tafsir as well that possibly he thought will define the meaning of the text. So text, Islam in general, is the Quran, the holy places, and the Khilafat, and they managed to do all of that. So he might have been interested politically in producing or in giving the Ottoman world also an authoritative work of tafsir.
And the Kashwaf is available? You say is that a book, is an essay on Kashwaf?
Sorry, there is a treatise on the the permissibility of cash waqf. Yeah.
Which is interesting because it still is a new issue, the Kashwaf.
It resulted from a dispute with the previous Shaykh al-Islam. Cash waqf, yeah. Waqf of money.
Yeah, because it was potentially difficult question in the definition of the waqf. The things must remain because it's tahbis al-mal tasbil al-manfa'a. So with money, how it works, how you keep the money and you donate the benefit. So I'm interested in that.
I don't think it's published, but maybe the manuscript is accessible.
Okay.
Yeah, I have one other question actually. Yeah, I mean you've corroborated it clearly by multiple routes. Yeah, the argument. So it doesn't apply to you. But I've seen in other cases. I'm just looking for a comment. In other cases where people are categorizing, in intellectual history within Islamic studies, people are categorizing scholars. Okay, and they're looking for. They're categorizing according to their athar in the biographical works. Yeah, what have they published? Yeah? But to me, this is very, very deceptive, extremely deceptive. Yeah, because just because a person has been teaching fiqh for 30 years and their publications are then through their students in fiqh, yeah, it doesn't seem to me to be a fair reflection of the scholar. So I'm thinking of a particular case, yeah, where somebody's classified in the Safavid period and made a distinction between fuqaha and anti-fuqaha, if you like, or because externalists and internalists. Some has a philosophical trend, and some are of a looking at the external position of Islam, and these are the fuqaha. Yeah? Now, as a student of teachers like these, they may be teaching predominantly fiqh, but it doesn't mean that their disposition is as a faqih. There may be, here most of them are teaching fiqh.
This is exactly what I'm arguing about Abu Saud, who's known as the Mufti and Shaykh al-Islam, that in fact there is evidence, because there is evidence to say that he was interested in tafsir, and that tafsir was or constituted a cultural as well as a religious expression of knowledge and competence in a different way to fiqh, and was obviously on the basis of his preface, and not only the bibliographical and biographical data, so not only the list of publications. He doesn't have a huge literary legacy. He had a huge impact on Sunni Islam and Sunni orthodoxy in establishing the Khilafat system of the Ottoman Empire. So his impact was historical rather than literary. But where there is literary impact, it's a tafsir work. But I'm referring this to his milieu, or trying to understand this by understanding his context and milieu, and understanding his own writings about his tafsir. Some of the material that I didn't manage to talk about here is a famous debate which is related to Al-Zamakhshari's interpretation of verse 7 of Surah Al-Baqarah. And this debate took place in the 14th century between At-Taftazani and Al-Sharif al-Jurjani, which led to the depression and death of Al-Taftazani because he was defeated in the debate. And it was about metaphor. How do you understand metaphor? How do you classify metaphor? Very, very briefly, is metaphor isti'ara or lexical on one word borrowing, or is it, can you borrow a whole sentence, so to speak? And it led to the defeat of Al-Taftazani. But that dispute was reenacted a couple of times in the Ottoman context, and one of those more known times is between Abu Saud and one of his contemporaries, where they disputed for 7 hours about the classification of metaphor, which led to the writing of several treatises after the dispute. So his interest in metaphor and how he applied it in tafsir can be corroborated by historical material as well as what he says about it in his own tafsir. So I've got a lot of material. What I'm interested in is not to argue that Abu Saud was more important as a mufassir than a faqih or a faqih than a mufassir. What I'm interested in is to talk about how the tafsir, what sort of tafsir activities took place around that time, how important tafsir was for that milieu, but also that the tafsir of that time was very much centered on Arabic language and Arabic rhetoric, and that it was connected to the classical, discussions of Abdul Qahir, and that it wasn't just dead repetition of the past, and that some of the reformist claims and Orientalist claims about tafsir and those centuries are not very correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think thank you. You can have some tea and coffee.